collapse of the Imperial German government and the army had come quickly in November 1918, with the announcement that the war was lost and the government was suing for peace. The ruling classes had simply lost their will. The Imperial Chancellor, Prince Max von Baden, resigned and announced the abdication of the Kaiser and the Crown Prince. The Imperial Navy mutinied at Kiel as a result of rumors that it was being ordered into a last suicidal attack against the British Navy. Sailors' councils took control of the ships at Kiel and at the main port of Wilhelmshaven, and mutiny soon spread to every other German port. This prompted soldiers stationed in Germany themselves to turn against the government. Groups of hungry, desperate, politicized workers and soldiers began a Bolshevik-style revolution by seizing local governments and proclaiming workers' councils on the Soviet model. A left-wing social democrat, Kurt Eisner, overthrew the Kingdom of Bavaria, establishing the Bavarian Social and Democratic Republic in Munich in November of 1918. Eisner ironically remarked that it took just 8 men and 8 hours to overthrow the Wittelsbach monarchy that had ruled Bavaria for 800 years. Eisner also demanded an immediate peace, claiming that Berlin did not have the will to end the war. The disintegration of the once proud German Reich occurred largely because there was no one to stop it. The German state had collapsed, and there was no legitimate authority to give orders to those soldiers who still remained loyal. The officer corps remained fiercely monarchist, and many refused to obey the civil authorities who tried to fill the power vacuum after the abdication of the Kaiser and the armistice of November 11. However, even if the officers had cooperated with the provisional government, the disillusioned and defeated common soldiers would probably not have obeyed orders to suppress the popular insurrections and strikes. They were becoming increasingly radicalized themselves by Soviet agents and by Marxist revolutionaries in their midst. And they were starving, they were demoralized, and they were defeated and humiliated. They were looking for someone to blame. Still, there were attempts at sustaining order in what was once the German Empire. With the resignation of Max von Baden, a liberal nobleman who had spent all of his energy trying to arrange some kind of armistice that would at least leave Germany intact, power passed to Friedrich Ebert, the social democratic leader of the majority in the Reichstag. He was perhaps the last legitimate representative of the German people as the head of the largest party elected to the Reichstag in the last elections before the end of the war. Ebert was a very different kind of man from Max von Baden. He was very simple. His roots were extremely humble. The son of a saddle maker, he had risen through the ranks of the Socialist Party through ability and committed hard work. But what could, or what would, Ebert do to address the chaos into which Germany was rapidly descending? Moreover, the cosmic questions of what kind of post-war state did the German people want now that the Kaiser was gone had to be addressed. Originally, Ebert planned to leave that decision to a national referendum. He had hoped that once there was some measure of peace and there was some measure of stability, then in fact this could be debated in a rational and a reasonable manner and the voice of the German people could be heard. But he was overtaken by events. The success of Eisner's coup in Bavaria, together with the collapse of civil and military authority, and the worker and the soldier revolts in the north and the northeast, required him to act, to co-opt some of this intense rage by appearing to be far more radical and decisive than in many ways he was. So on the 9th of November, in front of a mass demonstration on the steps of the Reichstag, Ebert declared that Germany would become a republic. He did this in hopes that the angry, desperate, starving people would rally to this promise and in so doing focus their humiliation and anger on the defeated monarchy of the Kaiser. The House of Hohenzollern would be identified as the evil forces that had brought about their misery. Perhaps the Kaiser and his ministers then could be the scapegoat that would allow the German people to escape the kind of horror and the disintegration of public and military order that they were witnessing. Ebert's party, the Socialists, that formed the majority in the provisional government, had grown much farther away from the Marxism of Karl Marx than even those founders of the German Social Democratic Party that had been so vilified by Marx, vilified as collaborators with the bourgeoisie. Moreover, they were also patriots. They were moderate nationalists. And on top of it all, they were pragmatists. They were professional politicians, and they recognized the nature of the problems they faced. And the problems that they were forced to deal with in 1918, 1919 were of the most fundamental kind for any nation. For example, how were they to keep the federated German state together when local revolts, such as Kurt Eisner's in Bavaria, threatened to tear Germany apart and return the nation to the fragmented mosaic of states that had existed before 1871? With the emperor gone, who had been that glue and the source of universal cohesion for the empire, what was there now to keep the idea of a united Germany intact? How were adequate food and services to be provided to a starving population still suffering under a British blockade? Moreover, these starving people were now augmented by hundreds of thousands of returning embittered soldiers. It had been impossible to feed the civilian population, and now it would be necessary to feed the army as well. How was order to be restored? Who would give security to the German state when the entire apparatus of that state had literally disintegrated? These were the kinds of critical issues, the fundamental problems that Ebert and his provisional government had to address, and address immediately, before Germany spiraled down into complete and absolute chaos and anarchy. Moreover, in the Germany of late 1918 and early 1919, these tasks were far from easy, especially the matter of order. Not only had the traditional orderliness of German society broken down, but groups on the far left were actively trying, with some success, to foment a Bolshevik-style revolution, as had occurred in Russia just a couple of years before. The extreme communists, known as the Spartacus Union, or the Spartakists, named after the leader of that Roman slave revolt in the 1st century BC, encouraged strikes, demonstrations, armed marches, and disturbances in order to turn the workers into revolutionaries, to bring about a Marxist dictatorship of the proletariat. It had happened in Russia. Why couldn't it happen in Germany? Indeed, Marx had said that it would happen first in a highly industrialized nation. So if Lenin could do it in the backward agricultural state of Russia, surely the Spartakists could do it in highly industrialized Germany. To keep public order, Ebert, who was extremely hostile to Bolshevism, he was a moderate social democrat, remember, made an arrangement with the last imperial chief of the general staff to use the army, or really what was left of the army, against the revolutionary enemies of the provisional government. But that army was literally crumbling to small pieces as soldiers deserted by the tens of thousands and returned to their homes. The government was forced to rely then on bands of ex-soldiers, hardened from their days at the front, who rallied under their former officers to break up Spartacist or similar demonstrations. In addition, the ex-soldiers were used to support groups in East Prussia that had been formed to combat agitators that were coming from Russia into Germany to try and foment that Bolshevik revolution. Most of these ex-soldiers and ex-officers were alienated, unemployed professional soldiers. They were bitter in the extreme about Germany's defeat and fanatically opposed to the communists whom they loathed and detested. And in many instances, sadly, they equally despised the socialists who were indirectly employing them. These ex-soldiers were the dangerous Freikorps, or the free corps of soldiers who, unsavory as they were the only force able to confront the Spartakists, who were seen as much more dangerous as a threat to the provisional government. In early January 1919, the Spartakists attempted an armed revolution in Berlin that actually succeeded in forcing the government to withdraw and move to the city of Weimar. Berlin was overrun by the communists, and to meet that threat, the Freikorps marched on the capital. Through vicious and brutal street fighting, they drove out the Spartakists and they suppressed the revolt. And a bloodbath ensued, with the Freikorps taking out their hatred of the communists on both the leaders and the followers of the Spartacus Union. They killed 1,500 Marxists, including their leaders, Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht. Karl Liebknecht, who was the son of the founder of the German Social Democratic Party, who clearly had not followed his father's belief in the efficacy of the ballot box and remained closer to Marx's ideology of violent revolution in another moment of historical irony. The victory on the part of the Freikorps bound them much more closely to the government, despite the obvious distaste among socialists for relying on thugs, because that's essentially what they were, who were much more sympathetic to the extreme right than to Ebert's government. Consequently, the Freikorps grew ever stronger. They expanded beyond Berlin and into most of the larger German cities, where they crushed cells of communist worker and soldier Soviets, including in Munich, where the assassination of Kurt Eisner had resulted in the formation of a Soviet-style republic in Bavaria. Once again, the Freikorps reacted with a ruthless efficiency, a means of rooting out the communists. In Munich, 20,000 marched on the city and liquidated the revolutionaries. By 1920 then, it seemed that Germany had been pacified, but pacified not through the usual instruments and organs of the state, not through a police force or a properly constituted military, but through the brutal tactics of the Freikorps, these paramilitary thugs who had followed their officers in an ideological battle against the left, especially the communists and the left-wing socialists. Ebert had established a constituent assembly in Weimar, and eventually a legitimate elected Republican government replaced the provisional administration that had been established immediately after the armistice and the abdication of the emperor. But when the elections were held, Ebert and the socialists didn't win a majority in the new parliament, the Reichstag. They were the largest party, but the Catholic Center Party, that party that had arisen in opposition to Bismarck's Kulturkampf, and the parties on the right had recovered some of their equilibrium after the collapse of 1918. Moreover, they had wisely run extremely strong candidates who had personal appeal. But then you must add to this, perhaps the single most significant point, that the revolutionary activities of the Spartacists and the extreme left had discredited not just the far left, but reduced as well support for the moderate left, that is, the socialists under Ebert. The first legitimate Republican government had three enormous tasks facing it. First, it had to make peace with the victors. Second, it had to maintain the new constitution, which was approved in July 1919. Third, it had to establish an operating government, where the old imperial government no longer existed. The issue of peace further divided the new republic. Right-wing nationalists, ex-officers and soldiers felt that Germany was being unfairly punished for the war. Many of these believed that Germany had not been defeated at all, that Germany had not lost the battle. After all, there hadn't been one cataclysmic battle in which the forces of the Entente and the Americans had driven the Germans from the field. Nothing like that had happened. So many soldiers believed that the war could continue. They could have continued to fight on, but socialists and communists had stabbed Germany in the back by capitulating. The field officers of the army and the nationalist monarchists even demanded that the war continue, especially in the Eastern Front, against the Russians, seeing the threat from Bolshevism and particularly seeing the agents and the agents provocateurs that were being sent into Germany to foment revolution there. Victory to them was still possible. The rightist generals and the nationalists then had to be told in no uncertain terms by the new Republican government that they could not continue the war for the most obvious of reasons. There was no military hardware available. The number of soldiers and civilians that were not totally desperate for peace was tiny. And of course, the enemy had overwhelming strength and the Allies remained in place. But neither the army nor the ultranationalist Germans ever forgot the humiliation of the Weimar government's capitulation to the victors by signing that Treaty of Versailles. The new constitution that established the Weimar Republic, it took its name from that city where the Constituent Assembly met, having been driven from Berlin by the Spartacists, was a liberal document that was a beautiful exercise in statecraft, but it was a difficult document to execute. It provided for a strong central government and a powerful president, but it also left local administration in the hands of the various German states, because the German Empire had been a federated empire as well. It also encouraged the widest expression of opinion by instituting a proportional representation system in the lower house, the Reichstag. This was, again, an act of liberal ideology. Have the largest number of voices heard, ensure that all opinions would be able to be expressed, and to allow for as many people as possible to participate in government. But it also made it difficult, if not virtually impossible, for any one party to obtain a majority. Unfortunately, this noble experiment in statecraft allowed small, extremist parties to enjoy a national voice, and in many instances, by agreeing or not agreeing to join coalitions, an influence far greater than their numbers warranted. Because of the continued fear of a coup from the left, the president was given discretionary power, including that of suspending the Constitution in times of emergency. The Weimar Constitution was effectively doomed, because only the moderate wing of the Socialist Party wanted a left-of-center Republican government. Germany was dangerously polarized between a politicized extreme left and an extreme right. Communists and left-wing socialists believed that the moderates had betrayed Marx and the workers in putting down the Spartacist uprising of 1919. And the moderate right-wing elements, the industrialists, the landowners, the bankers, the civil servants, the military officers, never supported the Republic. They remained unrepentantly monarchist almost to a man, and they were completely committed to the idea of the German Empire, the Old Reich, as it was before 1914. Moreover, neither did the traditional German nationalists ever join the supporters of the Weimar Republic the way, to some extent, they should have. Because the nationalists associated the creation of a united Germany with the monarchy. They saw that in that Hall of Mirrors in 1871, it was the King of Prussia who became the Emperor William I, and the glue that held Germany together was the House of Hohenzollern. These were also unrepentant monarchists who saw the moderate socialists as just another group of crypto-Bolsheviks who were themselves illegitimate revolutionaries who could be manipulated until ultimately they could be removed and the clock could be turned back to 1914, which was, of course, their greatest desire. The old imperial military, the civil service, the national school system, the universities and the courts hadn't changed their composition from before the war. German society had always valued age and experience, so they left these older men in place, positions of great influence and power. But because so many of their younger, talented colleagues had died in the war, any hope of replacing the old guard was difficult, if not impossible. The attitudes then of this older group had been formed under Bismarck, and they looked back with nostalgia to the prosperity, the stability, the order of the Imperial German Reich. They believed that that had been the highest representation of the German people, and it had to somehow be recovered. Teachers taught their students to despise the Republic and the treaty that it had signed. Judges were lenient towards the ex-soldiers and right-wing thugs who attacked socialists and communists on the street and beat them. But simultaneously, those same judges severely punished those socialists and communists who were simply fighting in self-defense. And what of the army? Who was to be the army of this new republic? The Versailles Treaty had limited Germany to an all-volunteer force of 100,000 men. And where were these volunteers, of course, to be found? From the Freikorps, the paramilitary organizations that had maintained their uniforms, their sense of discipline, their sense of loyalty, and their commitment to the idea of the Reich. The loyalty of these men in the Freikorps was not in any way to the Weimar Republic, but to their officers, an allegiance that had been forged on the field of battle among men who shared not only a defining experience, but who shared values and ideologies. The army, as we'll see, would grant its support to those it approved, but it would abandon those that it disliked. The army, in fact, became almost a state within a state. The chief of the army negotiated with foreign powers, independent of the foreign ministry, attempting to undo unpopular government diplomatic gestures because he identified them as socialists or internationalists. And the army sought to establish a strategy for fighting the next war. He said that what the army should be doing is not talking about peace, but beginning a new war plan so that we can in fact undo Versailles. The chief of the army publicly said whenever he had an opportunity that his greatest ambition was the destruction of Poland. This is not the beginning of a lasting peace. This is not a moment to hope that the First World War was in fact a war to end all wars. Only in 1920 did the Weimar government feel sufficiently secure to reduce the number of soldiers to 100,000 men as required under Versailles. Had they done so previously, the state would have been endangered by risings from the extreme left, from the communists and the Spartacists. So it was necessary to keep these groups that really constituted an army in everything but name in place. Simultaneously with the creation then of this all-volunteer army, the government ordered that the Freikorps be disbanded right across Germany. So 100,000 of them who volunteered and were accepted into the army of the Republic, they're okay. But the others who did not join or who were left outside had to then put away their weapons and their uniforms. And of course, they refused. Rather than obey this order to disband the Freikorps, they marched on Berlin, where they proclaimed a seedy, right-wing East Prussian politician named Wolfgang Kapp the new president of the Republic. The army was mobilized, but it didn't put down the rebellion. In effect, it joined it. The commander of the army icily responded to the civilian ministers when questioned that, quote, German officers did not fire on their comrades. This forced the legitimate government to flee Berlin, and for a time it seemed as though the so-called Kapp Putsch was about to turn Germany into a military dictatorship, that the coup had been successful and the Weimar Republic had lasted a year. However, the polarization of German society again crystallized this confused situation. The socialist trade unions, who were strongly opposed to the extreme right of the Freikorps, and all of these actions and the Kapp Putsch, countered by calling for a general strike that paralyzed Berlin. And Kapp wasn't the best choice to lead a coup. He was indecisive, and he didn't quite know what to do next. So the Freikorps abandoned him. They left Berlin, but the example of the Kapp Putsch illustrated clearly the weakness of the Weimar state. It also revealed very clearly indeed that the army could not be relied upon to keep order or to protect the Constitution if the threat should come from the right. If the threat came from the left, it would be met with the most brutal oppression. If it came from the right, the army would likely join it. On the other hand, the Kapp Putsch galvanized the communists. They realized that this polarization of society was something now that had to be acted upon, that perhaps the moment had come. So the communists formed a Red Army of their own, again modeled on the war in Russia, and managed to mobilize 50 to 80,000 men. They started by capturing several small towns successfully and beginning what they hoped would be a civil war, just as the one was raging in Russia. Once again, the Communist Red Army had to be suppressed. And who else could do it but the 100,000-man volunteer army, supported once more by the Freikorps. And it was done, indeed, with even more vicious brutality, even more ruthlessness, and the slaughter of even more communists. It seemed as though the only thing that most Germans could agree upon was the fear of communism and the hatred of communism. Thus, the right emerged as the only political option for most Germans. So in the elections of 1920, the left and the moderates lost seats. The right-wing parties gained seats. The economic situation in Germany added immensely to the fears of the middle classes, to the despair of the poor, and to their hatred of the Treaty of Versailles, because not only were they humiliated publicly and militarily, they were humiliated politically, now they were also humiliated economically. They were the constant reminders of the humiliating provisions of Versailles, which embarrassed and outraged ordinary Germans. One of the most corrosive was that continued occupation of the Rhineland and the Saar by French troops. And the French, to impose the utmost humiliation on the Germans, used black colonial soldiers in their army of occupation, aware not only of German nationalism, but of the residual Darwinist racial theory that we've seen circulating among German intellectuals. This act was interpreted as an embarrassing reminder of German defeat and of French vengeance, that a race that the social Darwinists and racial theorists said, in fact, was lower on the evolutionary scale, in fact, having armed control over Germans. To exacerbate an already desperate situation, the requirement under the War Guilt Clause that Germany pay reparations both weakened the fiscal policies of the legitimate government and destroyed the household economies of ordinary Germans of every class. We must remember that when the Reparations Commission reported in 1921, the final bill to pay for the damage in France, Belgium, and elsewhere was more than 33 billion US dollars, or 6.6 billion pounds sterling. An incredible sum now, but in 1921, an insupportable burden. The Weimar Republic couldn't raise tax revenues sufficiently to pay this huge reparation without courting more social unrest and the threat of outright revolution. This was not a stable government, and so they had to ensure that the people would support it. But if they were taxed into poverty, that support would instantly evaporate. So in order to meet the reparations, the Weimar government simply printed more money. The result was extreme hyperinflation on a level never before seen in a major industrial state. Consider these numbers. In 1914, the exchange rate was 4.2 marks to the US dollar. In 1919, that is after the war but before the Reparations Commission reported, it was 8.9 marks to the US dollar. But by 1923, it was 25 billion marks to the US dollar. The entire economy disintegrated. But the biggest losers were the prosperous middle classes, the very group that should have been the strongest supporters of the liberal Weimar Republic. Their savings were wiped out, and as a class, they faced ruin in the 1920s. The novelist Erich Maria Remarque, the author of All Quiet on the Western Front, described the situation. In 1922, he had been the advertising director of a rubber factory. He, like all the managers, was paid twice a day. After each pay, he and his colleagues were given free time to run out to the shops to buy whatever was available, because by the end of the day, their salaries would have lost half their value. The workers, at least, could sell their labor when jobs were available, but real wages plummeted. Job protection disappeared as thousands of companies simply failed. This resulted in the disintegration of the trade union movement and a further alienation of German workers from the state, a state that no longer offered any hope, that offered no security, no future for them or their children. And with the destruction of the trade union movement in particular, another fundamental support for the socialists in the Weimar Republic collapsed. The situation in Germany deteriorated almost daily, with political assassinations in the streets, thugs taking politics into their own hands. This was best illustrated in Bavaria, where the suppression of the leftist separatist state by the Freikorps permitted the rise of a reactionary politician, Gustav Ritter von Kahr. Von Kahr and a group of supporters that included monarchists, anti-Semites, and former high army officers, including General Erich Ludendorff, the former chief of the Imperial General Staff, sought to overthrow the Weimar Republic at least once more in Bavaria, given there was now a history of separatist revolt in Bavaria. Attracted to this powerful group of right-wing conspirators was a strange young man who would eventually go on to lead the political right in Germany, Adolf Hitler, who led a small, radical right-wing party, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or, in its German acronym, the Nazis. It had a Freikorps of its own, the SA. In an attempt to foment a right-wing coup, Hitler preempted the aristocratic leaders and led his group in 1923 to overthrow the Bavarian state in his Munich beer hall putsch. This was rather a comic opera affair, and the aristocratic officers around Ludendorff had no intention of following a former army corporal who had, as one well-born nationalist officer remarked, the smell of cooking on his clothes. The coup failed, and Hitler was arrested and sent to jail for a short period of time, an opportunity he used to write his own manifesto, Mein Kampf, for my struggle, and plan his future, a future which would see Europe descend into a hell even more unspeakable than the slaughter of the trenches of World War I.